Welcome to the Chase Challenge Week 4. All right, this week we're going to be moving away from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their descendants in the land of Egypt, okay? And we're going to be focusing on someone else who does not live in Egypt. He does not live in the promised land of Canaan. No, he lives in the land of Uz. But before I preview his story, I want to wrap up where we're leaving things in the land of Egypt, okay? Because Jacob, whose name had turned to Israel, he ends up dying in the land of Egypt. He does not end up dying in the land that God had promised to give him. And in fact, when he passes away, there are 70 of his descendants that had moved to Egypt, and all of them were still in Egypt when he passed away. Well, when his favorite son, Joseph, dies, he also dies in the land of Egypt. He insists on something. Joseph insists that his bones will be taken out of Egypt. And he says, when God comes to your aid, when God rescues you, Joseph's bones remained embalmed in a coffin in the land of Egypt for over 400 years. But when Joseph insisted on this at his death, you know what it indicates about what Joseph believes? Number one, it indicates that Joseph believes that suffering is inevitable. Suffering is coming. He knew that even though all the sons of Israel, all the descendants of Israel had these wonderful promises of a land, a nation, a blessing to the whole world, he knew those promises belonged to them. He knew that suffering was inevitable and that they would go through suffering. But the second thing that it indicates about Joseph and his beliefs is that Joseph believes that God is able to rescue them and that he will rescue them. It wasn't the end of Jacob and his descendants' story. It wasn't the end of God's story. And Jacob and Joseph both knew that, even though they never saw the promises fulfilled in their lifetime. As it turns out, all of the children of Israel, all the descendants of Jacob, whose name had turned to Israel, ended up as slaves in Egypt for 430 years. Not only were they slaves, but they were horribly mistreated. They were put under severe hardship, and it was a time of suffering. It was a time of suffering for God's chosen people. The people who had these wonderful promises that God had given to them, they went through this horrible season of suffering. And ironically, it is believed that during this time, someone who was not a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob, someone who was not a receiver of these promises that were given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, somebody that was distantly related through Noah's son Shem, but not a direct descendant, a man who lived in the land of Uz. It is believed that while the children of Israel are suffering as a nation in the land of Egypt, Job is suffering and enduring very personal suffering in the land of Uz. Now, like I said, Job did not have the same promises that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had been given and their descendants. He was not a direct descendant of Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. He did not have the promises of land, a nation, a blessing to the whole world, but he did have a relationship with God. God was still chasing after Job. God was still pursuing Job. He wanted Job to know and understand him. Now, Job related to God. He had a relationship with God. He thought he knew God. He did know God to a certain extent. And I don't know where you are in your relationship with the Lord, with God, and what you know about God or what you think you know about God, but I can guarantee you this, there's more about him to know. There's more to see than what we've seen. And even though God had a relationship with Job and Job had a relationship with God, Job was relating to God based on who he believed God was. He had a relationship based on what he believed God's relationship with humankind was. But his beliefs needed a little refining. He needed to know more about who God was. He needed to see God in a way he hadn't seen him before. And God was going to reveal himself. God was going to do this through a season of intense suffering. So as we move into the story of Job and we leave for just a couple of weeks, about a week and a half, we leave the children of Israel in Egypt in slavery. I want you to ask yourself these questions as you delve into the life of Job. Number one, I want you to answer the question, who and what did Job think he had at the beginning of the narrative? Who and what did Job think he had? By the end of this week's reading, which is not the end of Job's story, by the end of this week's reading, who and what did Job think he has now? Number two, what statements does Job make indicates that he has some level of faith and trust in God? As his suffering continues, what does Job begin to believe about his life, and what does he begin to believe about God? How does that change as he suffers? Next, what does Job think about his friends? What does he think about what they're saying about him, and what does he think about what they're saying about God? Does he agree with it? Does he disagree with it? How does he feel about his friends? Maybe you are in the middle of a season of suffering as you're reading this story of Job and his suffering. Remember, it's not the end of Job's story, and it's not the end of your story either. God's not finished. God's not finished writing your story. And what you believe about him may not match up with how you feel about him or what your circumstances are saying about him right now. And you know what? That's okay. That's okay. Tell God how you feel. Tell God what it looks like to you right now. He can handle it. He could handle what Job said. He could handle what Job's friends said. He can handle it if your beliefs do not line up with reality, with who he really is. But don't stop chasing him. Don't quit talking to him and dialoguing with him as Job continues to dialogue with God and about God as he goes through his suffering. Give God time to reveal himself to you. Give God time to open up your eyes to who he is and what he is doing. Eventually, the rest of the story will be written. And it's a good story.